we're going to sort of whiz through it reasonably quickly, and I won't go into too much detail. So everyone's discovered the chat box, which is good. So the format that we're going to follow this afternoon is we're going to have a conversation with the main guests, and hopefully you guys will join in on the chat box, and we'll bring you in if there's an appropriate moment, and that's the plan. So we'll introduce the guests properly in the moment. So you've told us where you are. Annabelle, you had another challenge for people you wanted them to do in the chat box.
I did, yes. Just one word and real quick fire round, so quick as you can. Just say one word to describe how you're feeling. So just shout them out and we'll just have a whole... So just tune in. What are you feeling right now? Okay, fast as you can. Let's get them out there. So, frazzled, tired, euphoric, ambivalent, knackered, stressed, hot after a walk, hopeful, relaxed, interested, excited.
Oh, well, there we go.
Fantastic.
We'll soon... Oh, brilliant. Okay, well, let's keep those sorts of things coming. And later on, we're going to ask, we're going to throw it open to you and ask, I don't know if you saw an email we sent out saying, tell us your stories about strange things you've been asked to communicate during lockdown. We'll come back to that later, but feel free to start filling those in as we go. And the last thing, obviously, the participants box, which you can see up the side there. We're going to put you all on mute in a second, with the exception of the main speakers. But if you want to raise something, rather than just waving at us, which seems to be very popular, you can, in the participants box, raise your hand, and either Annabelle or I will come to you and check out things with you. So there we go. Just to let you know, we're also recording the session, so anything you say may be taken down and used never against you, and anything you don't say now you can't use in your defence later. But just to let you know, we're recording the session as well. So we've been joined by some well-known faces from around the world of IC, not just on the general group, but on our guests as well. Annabelle.
Yes, so we've got three wonderful guests, and our first guest is going to be Kim England Godber, and she describes herself as an award-winning community builder and a problem-solving tech geek. She works at Pearson and has been the Director of Strategic Comms and Ops, following long-held roles in communications and community management at Pearson, the educational publisher. And we'll be chatting to her about her experience of community building, both within Pearson, so the inside story, but also the experience she's gleaned from working in two very interesting communities that we'll come on to and tell you about when we interview.
Oh, and we're also, I think most of you are going to know Katie McCauley. She's the MD, CEO of AB, the Internal Comms Consultancy. And as a complete suck-up, I've got a copy of her book here. I guess most of you are going to be familiar with her IC podcast. And we're going to get her to share some of her experiences about doing the podcast with us today. So that's coming up.
And last but not least, we have the wonderful Gavin Elbert, who is the founder of Elwood Atfield, the recruitment specialists, and they are specialists in identifying communicators and influencers. And Gavin advises global brands, CEOs of trade bodies and professional organisations. He is going to be talking to us about the state of the employment marketplace, perhaps the impact on the younger generation coming through, and perhaps comparing this sizable event, which is COVID, against previous sizable events he's heard in his over 20 years of headhunting experience. So some really, sorry, did you wince then when I said that?
I did, yeah, that makes me old. That's okay, I am old, so it's all right.
You're in good company with Liam and me, don't worry. So without further ado, Liam, is there anything else you wanted to say before we dive in?
No, you were going to ask the panel a question, I think.
Yep, so Kim first, in the hot seat. So as I mentioned, you've been at Pearson for around 12 years now. Can you just give us a little pen portrait of the culture there that you work in and operate in?
Yeah, sure. So I have been at Pearson for 12 years, and I think what's been really interesting is it's a company that's gone through huge transformation. So we were kind of a collection of companies. So you might be familiar with brands like the FT and Penguin. And we've really streamlined down to being a focus on education. So global education, we're across 44 countries across the world, and we support learners in all the different ages and stages of their lives. But through that sort of 12 years, we've also been on a huge digital transformation. So much like many companies, we've had to wrestle with, what does digital mean for learning? And I think it was quite slow on the uptake. If you actually go to a classroom today, you will still see a very traditional environment where there's a teacher normally stood at the front of the classroom, and a lot of the learning will still happen through textbooks and through sort of traditional methods. But the transformation in the digital space is, fast approaching, and it's going at a record speed now, not least because of COVID-19 and then the need to be able to do digital learning and to be able to do the online learning at all the different ages and stages, whether you've got children that are now dialing into Zooms and having their teacher teach them, or online degrees now being in much more demand. So as a company, it's been 12 years, but it's never felt like I've sort of sat still in terms of kind of what we've been doing and what we've been sort of working through. And also because we grew through acquisition, we've constantly had an evolving culture, which has meant that, we've got some of the sort of traditional academia in people who have worked, for 25, 30 years in education at Pearson. And beyond that, I think the longest standing person from a company that we've acquired, I think, is about 42 years, to people who are joining our organisation that are focused on things like AI and creating apps where it can help you with calculus and algebra, and really thinking about, how we can take technology to transform learning and support teachers to give better results and outcomes for students. So it's been a big shift when I think back to 12 years ago, but it's kept me on my toes.
Of course, and as you say, massive transformation, and not least in the last few months. How has the company coped with COVID? What have been the things that have worked well, or perhaps if you had hindsight, you might have done differently?
So I think as an organisation, we've done a pretty good job. We just recently did a pulse survey with our employees to find out what they actually thought of our response, and we got an 82% approval rating in terms of our response. And I think the things that we did early on was take some lessons from our colleagues in China. So we have a big Chinese operation. We also have a big operation in Italy. So two of the big areas that I think very early on were impacted, we started to think about what we could learn. We created a community on our Drive platform, which we call Neo, to basically create one place where all of the information for everybody was. We felt like, the challenge that everybody had was that obviously in certain countries, the rules were constantly changing. So it wasn't really a one size fits all. So some of our countries were closing down, other countries were not in that position yet. So, it started as like, we're going to ban international travel, then we were banning local travel. And then we were constantly having to respond to the needs of the different governments as they sort of changed the goalposts on certain things. So we had one source of truth. And I think from the get-go, being able to have that one source of truth, that one place that people could go to get up-to-date information, was definitely the way forward. I think sort of in hindsight, the lessons that we've learned, I think we shut our offices down sooner than a lot of the governments and allowed people to work from home. I think that for us was a key sort of step forward, I think, in terms of just helping everybody. But I think a lot of people were not necessarily that used to working from home in some of our call centres and some of the sort of kind of more customer focused roles. So I think in hindsight, it would have sort of helped, I think, if those people had an opportunity to be more prepared. We never knew this was coming, like most people, and we did manage to get operations to work from home. But that group, I think, was an underserved community when we think about remote working. We'd never really helped them to understand what remote working feels like, looks like, and I think that's sort of something that we've definitely learned, and they've had to learn incredibly quickly.
How have you maintained culture through this, with everybody now working from home? What tactics have you used to maintain that sense of community and the positive culture at Pearson?
So I think having Neo has really helped. It's something that's very embedded in our organisation anyway. I think, Liam, you were talking as we sort of first joined the call about the difference between people having their camera on and people having their camera off. Pearson's been quite a video conferencing enabled organisation sort of for the last 5 years. We moved to Google about 5 years ago, and I think once we moved to sort of using Gmail and the G Suite, it did sort of build a kind of video culture. So I think I actually feel quite odd when I have meetings with people when they have got their camera off, because it's sort of, you know, I'm used to looking in the eyeball, you know, the blue of someone's eyes, and it sort of sets me a bit on edge, because I don't necessarily know what their body language is or how they're receiving my message. So I think because with that kind of organisation, we've been able to maintain a lot of the kind of cultural sort of, you know, approach that we've had, because we've been doing it for a while. However, we have had to put a bit more effort in. So we've had lots of discussions in our community about what can you do to draw out some of the people who perhaps are not that comfortable with this kind of setting. So, you know, lots of people were having these like happy hours and, you know, big group sessions on Zoom, which is great. But if you're an introvert and you're not comfortable speaking in that kind of environment in a public way, if you're in a meeting room, you're probably not going to necessarily be super comfortable doing it just because it's a video conference. So we've encouraged people to make sure they're having those one-to-ones or two-to-one conversations still, and checking in on people. So we have something called the Remote Working Manifesto, which we wrote a few years ago, but we've updated it based on sort of what's happened in COVID. And in there's lots of things like start your meeting 5 minutes early and do check-ins. You know, ask people how they are. If children come in and interrupt the meeting, include them and make them feel welcome. Our CEO, John Fallon, was really clear about that at the beginning. He was like, we have to embrace this, right? So if you've got kids at home and you're trying to do the homeschooling thing, that's fine. Kids are going to interrupt Zooms. We just have to work with it. And I think that straight away made people feel a lot more comfortable about the situation. So we have a good culture, I think, and our employees have told us that it seems to be working.
Okay, I'm sure that will resonate with lots of people. There's comments coming through, particularly around a lot of people had to switch tactics and we were all reacting to what was going on. But now, is there a sense that you're having to now switch back to looking strategically what Q3, Q4 are going to look like and long beyond? Just in a brief nutshell, then I've got a couple of key questions around two other big parts of your life I'd like to cover.
Yeah, I think for us, it's just figuring out what the new workspace is going to look like. I mean, we've been doing these tabletop discussions about, you know, looking at things like what's the government expecting? Do you wear masks? Don't you wear masks? So I think what we're trying to really help our employees understand is that even when we open the offices, they're not going to be the office environment that we remember back in February that we left. So I think we're just really trying to get our heads around what that looks like. And actually, do we all need to be back in the office? I mean, that's, I think, the $1 million question for all of us right now. So we're just working through that at the moment.
Okay. And then I'm going to surprise everybody on the call now, because in 2015, your life took a very different turn and you ended up driving a transit van to Slovenia with £3,000 worth of aid supplies. What on earth led you to do that? And what has it helped you, how's that helped you translate building communities back into Pearson? Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, so, I mean, I've been a community manager since 2010. And I think if people tell me I can't do something, I try to prove them wrong. And so when the refugee crisis happened in 2015, I felt pretty helpless. I saw the picture of Alan Curry, who had been washed up on the beach in Turkey, and I was like, I have to be able to do something. And at every turn, everyone said, oh, just donate money to like Save the Children or, you know, Oxfam or whoever, UNICEF. And I was like, no, I want to go and like do something. I feel really, really helpless. So raised some money, borrowed a transit van, filled it with aid, and a friend of mine who also worked at Pearson to get volunteer hours, we just set off on a mission. We weren't really sure where we were going, but through the power of social media, there were groups that were popping up all along the sort of trail of where refugees were. And by the time we were sort of getting closer to Slovenia, we'd found a group that needed help. There was a lot of people that were on the border of Slovenia into Austria, in fields overnight, no food. And so we just kind of did it and made it happen. And ever since that point, I've now been sort of supporting refugees in different guises and in different ways. So I think from a community point and sort of how it crosses over with work is it's really important, I think, that when you bring the power of community and the power of people together for positive change, you can literally do anything. And I think, you know, what's happening in the world in the last sort of 2 weeks is showing that when, you know, you bring lots of people, lots of great minds together and you think about collective empowerment and positive change, you can really move mountains. So, yeah, never want to shy away from doing something if someone tells me I can't.
And clearly the same with Black Lives Matter. We can't have this call without mentioning that. So I know you're doing work on that internally at Pearson as well. And then finally, another twist and turn in your life. In 2018, sadly, your son was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And I understand you've now become as you call yourself, a cancer mummy blogger. So just tell us a little bit about that. Again, what experience has that given you, and how do you play that back into your role in internal comms and strategic comms?
Yeah, so I think I've never really been one for writing. I mean, I'm an internal communications person, so I'm used to like, how do you make this change message super simple and land? But actually what's happened with my son being diagnosed with leukemia is I needed a way to just deal with the situation. And what I found myself doing was actually writing. So I started a travel blog about sort of 3 months before he got diagnosed. It was supposed to be all about our family adventures. And actually it morphed into a cancer blog where I sort of shared our experience. And in those early days, when every day was different in terms of like where he was with his treatment and sort of how we were managing things, it actually became the place where I was able to offload, and really was my mental health crutch to sort of get me through what we were sort of experiencing. Now, I mean, we're 18 months into treatment. We're just about to hit the halfway mark. When I look back, it's actually almost a record as well of like a life I don't even sort of remember that much, because there was so much happening. But what I've been able to use that blog for is to share with other parents as they start their journey, or other, parents who, not necessarily leukemia, but cancer, or even, other people who get cancer, what happens, how it happens. And I was always really open to people asking questions. No question was a silly question, to try and just demystify kind of what happens, because from the inside looking out, I was just staggered at the underfunding, how much the government, falls short in terms of support for children with cancer in general, but in this case, children with cancer, that was then plugged by charities like Click Sargent and the various different cancer trusts. So I felt like if I could lend my voice to something to try and sort of create positive change or just awareness, then that would be helpful. But in terms of what it means at work, I've kind of found this like new strength in terms of creative writing. And I've actually really enjoyed doing more of the writing at work. And I write a lot about communications about COVID and some of the stuff that's happening around our D&I space. And it's kind of opened up a new area of work for me, because it's something that I had never really thought I was very good at. And I've, kind of mastered that skill, not mastered it, but I've worked on that skill in a different way. So I've been able to bring that back into work.
It's really inspiring. Thanks, Kim. And what I'm hearing from that is, if you are feeling strongly about something and then you communicate that either written or a podcast or vodcast, it actually starts to bring people around you, and you can start to share experience, but also learn from each other, and hopefully inspire other people to adapt to change, which is what we're all facing at the moment. So thank you very much. Really appreciate you being honest about what's going on for you. And I think we'll hop back to you. There's lots of questions coming through, but I'm keen now for Liam to take on our
I find it really fascinating, because Kim pops up in various social media channels on my world, nothing whatsoever to do with the comms. You pop up in all sorts of places. And the other day I was talking to my wife and about something, and she said, "Oh, there's this woman called Kim who goes, oh, okay." So you penetrated there, and then you've got other friends locally who know you. It's just quite interesting how actually just once you get into that world of making connections, it sort of goes all over the place, doesn't it?
We've had a query. Would you be able to share the name of your blog?
I'll put a link in.
Yeah, thank you.
So I was interesting actually. It's interesting how things seem to have changed a bit as well for people during the lockdown. And we asked the question beforehand of people, what's the strangest stuff that they've had to communicate during lockdown? Because I'm sure a few of us have been asked to get involved with stuff, and I'm quite curious to see what sorts of things people are talking about. And Simon's told us about online fitness routines, which I'm sure, from the sounds of it, I suspect Ben's been using, because he's obviously all muscled up, as he said. I'm quite curious, what other kind of strange stuff have people had to communicate? We'll see what's coming up in the chat feed. That'll be interesting to see. It's all wrong. Well, you're all being very, very reticent about about what you've had to communicate quietly. So, Lisa Attenborough's telling us about a social distancing app, which actually sounds quite intriguing. Actually, love to know what that was all about. What else has people? We've had people from, and we've got people from around the world here. It'd be interesting to see if people were communicating different stuff in different parts of the world.
At the beginning of lockdown, I told all the people that I work with very closely that actually the #1 priority was their own health, the second priority was their family and their safety and well-being, and then the third priority was work. And actually they had to spend the first week or two really getting strategy together for themselves that looked after their own health, whether that was the hour's walk each day or doing some yoga, some online stuff, and then working together as a family, how they were going to approach lockdown and putting posters up on their walls, whatever it might be. And then to think about how we were going to adapt what we did in the workplace. And I kind of felt that was really important from day one, and it stood us all in good stead, and touch wood, so far people are in good shape. But remembering that order of priority, I think, is always really key.
Yeah, that's my daughter was telling me that her strangest experience was showing Esther Ranson how to use Zoom. She said that was quite strange and surreal. So I'm now intrigued though, because Ben's jumped in, and I think I'm going to have to unmute you, Ben, to get you to tell us what that was all about. Have you got a second there, Ben?
Yeah, sure. I work in East London in Tower Hamlets, which has a 40% Bangladeshi community. And right from the start of lockdown, there were no deliveries from Bangladesh of palm, betel nut and tobacco and all sorts of other addictive ingredients in that. Eventually, when one of the shops did get a delivery, I kid you not, there were probably 1,000 people in the street desperately trying to get their palm. There were a few scuffles and stuff, and it ended up with the army being called in to break up the crowds. Communications-wise, it was difficult, of course, because this was seized on by the Katie Hopkins of this world, as look what's happening with these dreadful minorities. And equally, we've got a very vocal Bangladeshi community who were, why are you picking on us? You're always picking on us. So it was a challenge. Fortunately, it was one of those where really my role was to relay the blue light services messages, so I didn't have to think too much about it.
Thanks,
Oh,
Ben.
I'm going to ask Lisa to tell us about her. I love her story as well. I'm just going to mute you, Lisa. Thanks, Ben.
Just a sec. I'm sorry. I'm in upstate New York, and the Wi-Fi is so bad that apologies. Sorry. What was your question?
So, Lisa, you told us. You mentioned your anecdote about was it loving the having to toast people at the virtual wedding. Do you want to just tell us about that?
Well, I have to say I've done about every thing you can do virtually. I went to my first virtual funeral, which was great because normally rabbis go on and it's insufferable, and they had to limit it, which I think is a great idea. At a Jewish funeral, you don't want to be standing in the wind blowing with the rabbis going on and on. I've done Passover. I've even been to a virtual wedding, but I think the most intriguing was the wedding anniversary, where he didn't want gifts. He didn't want anything but us to really reflect on what it means, love in the time of Corona means. And actually, it was really interesting because at first I thought he was joking, but it was quite beautiful. People really were quite reflective about, everything from being forced to isolate to being forced to celebrate each other. It ended up being one of the more touching events that I went to. So
I think it's fascinating that some of the non-work things that I've joined in on, and conversations I've had with people that I think actually it's the lockdown and Zoom that made them happen. I think that's for me the amazing thing.
One thing I did notice I've been to a number of these parties for couples since lockdown, and one thing I noticed was that that this has become, this virus, the quarantine has become a kind of relationship accelerator. And I've noticed that either you get on really well together or you just completely fall apart. But it does one or two things, but it does it very well. So I've also seen couples that were ready to split suddenly transform and become wonderful together.
Oh, that sounds lovely. That sounds lovely.
Liam, we've got one more from Rob Briggs. Are we able to bring Rob on to just mention what he?
Yeah, Rob. Let me see. Obviously, I've got the power to get people to talk or not here. Rob, can you unmute yourself, or do you need me to unmute you?
I've unmuted myself. If you can hear me.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Lisa. Yeah.
Sure. My tale's an interesting one because I started attending more and more of these online Zoom sessions with different groups. And one that came around fairly tangentially was with a lady called Kim Page, who some of you may have come across. And as part of one of Kim's sessions, I was in a breakout room with a lady called Dr. Alice Cash. And she's absolutely fascinating. She's a lady, very, very highly experienced and qualified lady who's in her early 70s and based in Louisville in Kentucky. And what she does is she helps hospitals and surgeons to use music as a medicine to help relax patients as they're going through surgery. So this was very, very intriguing. I'd never heard the like of it before. When you start to look into the neuroscience of it, the music affects the brain in very specific ways. It can also, studies have shown, reduce or increase your tolerance to pain by about 20%. And this is completely, obviously, non-invasive, but it's a very novel practice for hospitals. So I was chatting away to her, and we're working together on a presentation she's been invited to do with a group in Abu Dhabi, where they're interested in at least learning a little bit more about her process.
Oh, that's certainly interesting. Certainly get people talking. So, and what about you, Katie? Have you you must have over your 30 or so years been dragged into some quite interesting communications challenges?
Yeah, I started life as a journalist, so too much Lois Lane growing up. That's what I blame it on. I didn't really get Superman, the whole pants over tights, but Lois was fantastic. So started off in journalism, but when I first got my first job in telecommunications, it was 1990, so I'm taking you back quite a while. But in those days, my big client that I was given to look after was Tetley Tea. And the thing about tea in those days was that the tea bag had been invented in 1953, and nothing had changed. Nothing had changed, right? So you bought the tea your parents bought, right? And so that had gone on for years. And this is a £700 million business. I mean, this is a big business, right? But then in 1990, Tetley invented the round tea bag. And off I trotted in my early 20s, all excited, thinking this was the big scoop, that I was reporting for the Tetley magazine, which had been around since the 30s. And I saw these big round tea bags come off there. It's like a big printing press. And I was just horrified. And I said to the factory manager, and I was, I suppose I was for the cause, and I was very green in those days, environmentally green as well as green. And I said, but this is dreadful, because I just realised that round things don't tessellate, and you've got all this wastage. Oh my goodness me, that was such the wrong thing to say. He was so proud, and everyone was so proud, and this was going to transform the market, and he really didn't need a 23-year-old telling him that he was now damaging the environment. So it's just a lesson in life to kind of, remember why you're there and the right question to ask at the right time.
So Katie, you've been doing the ITC podcast now for what? You've done 3 series. It's turned out to be incredibly popular, hasn't it? And you've had 30 episodes, and you told me the other day that you'd had 35,000 or so downloads. And what got you started on doing the podcast then?
The real truthful answer is I was just about to turn 50. That's the truthful answer. And I was secretly, I think, worried somehow. In the back of my mind, there was a little voice in my head going, you've just got to make sure that if you do another 10 years, Katie, or however long you do in this industry, it doesn't become the same year repeated 10 times. How are you going to keep yourself fresh and new? And there's all these amazing young people joining the profession, and you've just got to make sure that you're staying abreast of what's new and what's exciting and all the rest of it. So I thought, well, what better way just to go out and find people, practitioners, leaders, authors, consultants, and sit them down and ask intriguing, in-depth questions. So that's the honest answer. And I thought me and my mum would listen to it, and my sister. I'm nearly at 40,000 downloads in 55 countries around the world, which is just, I mean, for me, not a testament, nothing to do with me, but a testament to the importance of internal communication and how that's risen up the agenda. When we launched back just over 2 years ago now, I don't know what I expected. As I said, you know, I thought maybe some family might listen and some close friends. And the guys back at the office were watching what was happening on iTunes. And we entered the iTunes new and noteworthy chart at number 49. And then every hour I'd get someone rush in and say, we're at 23. We're at 19. And then we got into the top 10, and we ended up that day in I think number 9 in the new and noteworthy charts. And I just thought, wow.
Go on, tell us, who was the guest on that first edition?
Oh, well, that was Rachel Miller. Yeah, it was Rachel Miller. Yeah. Yes. So I trotted off to her shed quarters very nervously, having not really not knowing what I was doing, actually. And it was my first proper technical failure, almost. So we'd had 2 hours in-depth conversation. I didn't know Rachel very well, so I was nervous, but I got what I felt, you know, in the old journalist would say, I got the story, you know, I got what I needed. And I was just about to close the laptop, and she said, you might want to save that file. I hadn't saved it. And a podcast is very much in the moment. It's not so good when you go back and do it again. It's a bit like wedding photography. You've got one chance here, really, to get the capture the moment, you know. And I was like, thanks, Rachel. That's helpful. You're a great guest in more than one way.
So one thing that struck me, because you did me as well, which I'm shocked that's not the most popular episode ever, but it's kind of all very gentle. It's not, you know, it's hardly, you know, Jeremy Paxman. It's sort of, it's quite is there a reason why you've chosen that? Because, you know, there are some of us who, you know, probably do deserve a bit of a trot round the park.
Right. So I've got a sort of a few philosophies and rules that actually I've never shared these with anyone, but so I've got, a few of them. One is that it's never a catch you out podcast. I want everyone I interview, I want to show the very best of themselves to the audience. Now, you might not agree with what they're saying. You might even take offense to what they're saying, but I'm always going to make sure that I've done my research. And in fact, I had a recent chief executive that I interviewed. She said, have you actually been stalking me? But I really like to do my research to ask the most in-depth, relevant, meaningful questions, and then give them the floor. And I do also edit them to make sure that they're always showing up as their best self, if you like. And that's really very important to me. So the research is also incredibly important. I think it's the biggest compliment you can give to anyone, whether it's a recorded podcast or in real life, is the gift of attention and asking a really thought through question that shows you care about who they are. And you're not just running through kind of like off the shelf, here we go, question 1, 2, 3, 4, but you're listening. You're really listening to what they're saying. Yeah. So it's been...
you said to me when we chatted about this the other day, you said that that's the technique that you apply when you're working with clients or with chief executives, is, you know, that kind of researching them to, you know, within an inch of their lives. Did I understand that right?
Yeah, I mean, listening is such a powerful tool. You know, I've always said those that listen harder learn more, but it's absolutely true. But we don't, when you see adverts for chief executives or business leaders or whoever, you don't see first-rate listeners at the top of that list in terms of attributes and skills. And it's underrated. And a lot of people think listening is about waiting for the moment that you can interject. So most people are waiting to find out where they can say the next thing. And, you know, a lot of really, and I've learnt my listening skills when I was writing my book through meeting hostage negotiators, because I felt I needed to find out, we listen in our everyday lives because we just, you know, we want to make connection and we want to, as you say, understand what the client's thinking. But I wanted to find out about how those people who need to listen to save a life, how do you listen to get someone to put the gun down? Because that's where the rubber hits the road. I mean, really, you know, as I had a boss used to say, Katie, this is PR, not ER. But I thought, well, what if it was ER? You know, what if it was about saving your life? And when in speaking to him, if we've got time, I'll tell you this very quick story. In speaking to him, he told me a story about being called to a domestic siege situation. And a man had a wife tied up. It was actually his wife tied up. And he'd tied her to a chair, poured petrol on her head and was threatening to set fire to her. Awful, awful, awful situation. And his whole goal was to try and get this guy to talk, right? So he could listen to him. And eventually this guy starts to talk. And he says to Richard Mullender, the hostage negotiator, he says, you work hard, you look after your family, you come home, and this is what you find. And he suspected his wife of adultery. That's why he'd got so upset. And Richard turned to me and a couple of researchers that I'd got to help me write the book. And he said, so what has this guy just told me? What has he just told me? And we said, well, this man is clearly very angry and frustrated and probably feels a bit powerless. And Richard just goes, nope. Wrong, wrong, wrong. He's just told me he's a family man. He's just told me he actually loves and cares for his family in what he's just said. And so what do I go back and say? I say, I don't want to speak to some man who's got some woman tied up. I want to speak to the husband and the wife who loves his family. And that changed the whole course of the conversation. And I had this light bulb moment in my head and I thought, oh, values. We've been doing it wrong all our lives. My 30-year career has been a bit wrong when it comes to implementing values, because we rush to the front line and we go integrity, professionalism, and no, we should have been listening to the values in the room, you know, the values that everyone already holds dear, and building on those. And then you can bend people to your will if that's what you want to do as a leader, but listen to the values they already hold. Sorry, I went off on one then.
Yeah. Well, no, that's really interesting, because I mean, you probably can't see the chat box that's filling up. I mean, there's a couple of questions have come up directly related to that, because I think you seem to have touched on a point that matters to people, which is when you're working with leaders and getting them to be, you know, better communicators. Do you work with them on their listening skills? And someone else has just posed the question: do you think it's gender-based, the natural ability to listen along the way? So, two questions. One is, what advice do you give leaders when you're coaching them about their listening skills? And are there some people, is it by gender, or are there some people who are naturally better listeners than others?
Yeah, okay. I'll just take the second question first, because I think it's unfortunate, but I think as women, and I'm going to talk perhaps about when we've come a long way since 1990 and 1989 when I entered the workplace. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of women, I think, who don't speak up and lean into the conversation as much as they feel able. I think when we talk about things like imposter syndrome, they unfortunately feel it more than men. So we get our power from sitting there and listening. And we're the ones then able to ask the really intelligent question, because we've just sat there and soaked it all up. So I perhaps women are better listeners, but I think that's a default situation, because we end up being the ones sitting there quietly feeling we can't speak up. The question about leaders is, and I have this, I have this sort of, I don't know how I describe it. Every time anyone says to me that a leader should be doing more, and we often say that as strategic advisors, my heart goes out to them, and I always want to find out how we can ask them to do less. I think it's got really hard to be a leader. It was before, it's incredibly hard now, okay? So to say that a leader should be listening more, yes, of course they should be. But your job as a communicator or their strategic advisor is to do the listening for them. Let's be honest, I would love leaders to listen more, okay? But the reality is that there's a lot on their shoulders, and a great service you can do, and I mean this really wholeheartedly, is to be another pair of eyes and ears for them. And to tell them things that perhaps aren't told to them. And I can remember many chief executives over the years telling me this. I mean, I had, I'm not going to mention his name, but a chief executive at a bank, I spent a lot of time in financial services, who used to say to me, they'll talk to me in the room and they'll say all the right things, but that's not the conversation I want to hear. I want to hear the conversation that happens in the corridor outside this room, and I'm never going to get to hear that. So I think it's quite hard sometimes. Leaders don't get
really valid point. I had one chief executive I worked for once, and he said to me virtually exactly the same what he said. He said the entire organisation has a version of the truth they want me to hear. So when I sit down and have a meeting, I'm hearing the marketing director's version of the truth. I'm hearing the finance. No one's coming in and telling me what's really going on. That's your job, Liam.
Exactly.
Okay. So listen, we spoke the other day. I just wanted to just kind of finish up a little bit here. When we spoke the other day, I asked you. You've had some great guests. You've had people like Bill Quirk on there. You've got Rodney Dupree coming up soon. The great grandfather of internal comms. And I said to you, who are you missing? Who would you like more of? Who would you like? And you gave me a very interesting answer, which I think directly relates to what you just said about actually not having comms people. You said something about actually having
I would like more leaders. I would like more CEOs. I'd like more senior leaders. I think when I actually asked the profession who I should interview before I started the whole series, and people did say, let's not just hear from ourselves, but let's hear from outside the community. And I've had a couple of chief executives on now, and they've been absolutely brilliant, and I've really enjoyed that. I've got 3 people on my list though that don't quite, well, one does. So Paul Pullman. People might know Paul Pullman, ex-Unilever, ex-Procter & Gamble, speaks brilliantly and passionately about leadership. You Google him, any podcast he's ever been on is brilliant. Seth Godin, who I think is, if we don't know the answer as comms people, just ask Seth, just Google Seth and it'll come up with the right answer. He's just brilliant. He said no, of course he did, very early on in the series, to be a guest. But, I hold out hope one day I might get him. And then I kind of quite like to speak to William Kahn, because in 1990, Bill Kahn coined the phrase employee engagement in a research paper, and has been quite disappointed about what's happened since then. So I'd quite like to get him on the podcast and retrace his steps and what he thinks now to the whole employee engagement industry. I've got a few people left for season 4 I'd quite like to get. And also listeners, I'm very open to listeners' suggestions. I love it when listeners get in touch. And I try to respond to everyone that does, because it's a real broadcast mechanism, podcasting. It's like a baby. You pour all your love into it, you put it out there, and you just don't know what's going to happen. So it's nice when people respond and tell me what they think and who they want to hear from next.
Yeah. I think we probably ought to ask our next guest who he'd like to, who he thinks we should have on the podcast. Who would you like to hear, Gavin, on Katie's podcast coming up in the future?
Oh, blimey, that's a tough one. Well, Seth Godin is, yes, incredible. Would love to hear him. I think, without wanting to get too political, and this is not to declare any personal political preference, but given everything that's going on at the moment around communications from the government, I'd love to hear from Boris Johnson about his views and tactics on internal communications. Particularly around the cabinet and through the government, because I'm not so sure he's doing a great job. Perhaps hear where he's going wrong. I don't know. But yeah, I'll give that more thought.
Great
Oh,
stuff.
yeah.
Thanks, Gavin. I'm going to leap in here. With your political connections, perhaps you can get Katie hooked up with Boris. Let's see.
I'd love to.
So for those of you that weren't at the head of the call, Gavin is the founder of Elwood Atfield, a phenomenal recruitment agency specialising in the communications sector. I'm sure some of you have heard of them and perhaps even been placed by him, by his team of headhunters. In fact, I think Vicky on the call here knows Gavin very well through the Masterful, Worshipful Guild.
Company of Communicators.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yes.
I'll get it
Hi,
right.
Vicky.
So we've got just 10 minutes left, so I'm going to whistle through some questions for you, Gavin. And of course, you've got a great overview of the job market, and particularly in the light of what's happened over the last 3 months. Can you just sum up in a little nutshell how you perceive the job market and candidate confidence, as well as employer strategies at the moment? What's the pen portrait you can give us?
Certainly. It's changed enormously over the last few months, as you might imagine. And it's not been like any other crisis or major economic or event that has happened to the job market that I've seen before. Previously, when there's been a major event like 2008 recession or acts of terrorism, that have affected organisations and their hiring and the job market more generally. What tends to happen previously is that people will be reluctant to move. They'll consider the job that they're in at the moment quite safe, and be less likely to apply for jobs, less likely to respond to a headhunt call, or and more reluctant to take on a new job for the fear of being the last one in and the first one out. However, with this one, over the last few months, there's undoubtedly been a huge contraction in the job market. We have seen it contract more on the permanent side than on the interim side, and there are reasons for that I can go into separately if you wish. But what's been really interesting, well, one of the things that I found very interesting is that people have not been reluctant to move in a way that they have been with previous recessions. I think that, and I don't know why that is, but I just think it might be because everything is up for grabs at the moment. There is so much uncertainty that if an organisation is out there actively recruiting right now in this marketplace, then that can give the view that, or give the impression at least, that that job is being invested in. That job is really needed, and the job that you're in at the moment might be subject to redundancy in the next month or three. And so, unlike previous turbulent market conditions that have led to a contraction in the job market, what we haven't seen is a reluctance on the candidate side to look at new jobs, consider new jobs, or even accept new jobs. So whilst we've had, over the last few months, a lot of our work put on hold or cancelled, we have also still taken on new assignments, and we have been placing people during the lockdown, and people have started jobs during the lockdown as well, which has been an interesting experience for them too. So it's very, very different and cannot be compared to anything that I've experienced before.
In some of the work we've been doing, we've seen a real difference in or the impact on mental health and well-being, particularly if you're working from home and that's not an environment you're used to operating from. But that's exacerbated by those that are furloughed, because they, in some respects, think that they're going to be the next ones out if the company doesn't recover economically. So are you seeing more candidate interest from those that are furloughed than perhaps that are working from home, or have you not seen a big difference there?
I haven't seen much of a difference, to be honest. What I have seen a bit of a difference, I had speaking to a client just yesterday, in fact, who's looking at hiring they're new into their job. They've got to make some changes in their team. They need to hire a director level position, and they're planning at the moment on waiting until October. Partly because they're new into their job, they've got to get their feet under the table, but also because they think that, and I think it's a valid point too, that they will have more choice later in October after potentially a number of roles have been made redundant and more people will be actively looking in the marketplace. And so as a hiring manager, they're thinking they can maximize their chances of getting the best possible person if they wait a few months.
Okay. And what about those of us on the call who are managing the new generation of talent coming through? How do you think COVID and the new ways of working are going to impact on how perhaps some of us might have built our careers in the early days, which is, you know, a pint down the pub after work, or, you know, those group things that happen spontaneously in this new 2 meter distanced working from home predominantly? How's that going to impact on that career development?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Well, without a doubt, we're not able to meet and mingle at the moment, and we don't know when that's next going to be. So the random connections that can sometimes be so then fruitful and lead to something at some point in the future. I've met people and then we don't do anything together for a number of years, but it'll be years later, and it'll all go back to that point, that one chance meeting. That's harder to do now, and we don't know what it'll be like in the future, or for the foreseeable future as well. So for the younger generation looking to build their network, it's going to be far harder. Now, of course, theoretically, somebody's network peaks apparently at around about the age of 40. But what I'm seeing and what I'm wondering is if the younger generation, how much they're going to be suffering by not being able to build their network and what effect that may have on their career opportunity. However, Rachel Miller was mentioned earlier, and I'm sure like a lot of people, a big fan of hers. I've known her for a number of years, and I've seen over that period of time how much she has built her network and her profile, but she's done that, she's used digital tools to be able to do that. So there is still a chance for people to build and grow powerful networks, but do it virtually through collaborating and through networking. It all comes back to being active. So whether you're active digitally or whether you're active physically, as in going along to events and physically pressing the flesh and seeing the whites of people's eyes, nonetheless, it does still take a degree of action, forethought and planning. But I think that it's important to be thinking about that differently from a digital perspective and a virtual perspective if people are going to build, grow and maintain their networks in order to maintain and increase their chances of exposure to new and interesting opportunities. Because jobs come onto the market through three main routes: through people's personal contacts, through direct advertising or organizations directly headhunting themselves, or through recruiters and headhunters. Yeah. And so it's important to have a plan for each one of those three routes to cover off and gain exposure.
There's some points coming through on the chat too. So Leslie said the younger generation are already great at building their networks virtually, and that's echoed by Helen Plasto saying that they're using listening much more to the younger staff about how to do it better than perhaps we have in the older generation. So really using that as a reverse mentoring and harnessing technology. But I think the real life social skills, that's the aspect that might be pivoting slightly. So interesting.
Yes.
Point, perhaps one for Katie's podcast. There's a few people saying they're needing to run to various meetings and yoga sessions. So I think, Liam, we need to wrap up. But Gavin, thank you so much for that whistle to stop the clock.